If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
All we need is a little understanding. Walk a mile in their shoes. And if we keep our hearts open-minded, we'll enjoy this wild ride called life. And if we keep our hearts open-minded, we'll enjoy this wild ride called life.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the True Sweet High podcast. I'm really excited today because we have a guest who has actually served in the Israeli army. And I can't wait for you to hear her story because it's one that's not common for us here in the U.S., but also because of how she grew up and how she discovered really everything about her as soon as she became a mom. So please welcome Dorit Palvanov. And gosh, yes, thank you so much for being on here today.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this opportunity to share my story.
Absolutely. So let's start really quick because I know there's many of us who are unfamiliar with the process in Israeli, but just a little really quick a recap. I've known some people in Germany that had to serve once they graduated high school, but I did not know that the same happened in Israel. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. So the way it works in Israel, and if anybody is familiar with the Middle East and whatever is happening there, Israel is a tiny little country that is surrounded by enemies, for lack of a better word. Countries that don't necessarily agree with the politics, it's a history long debate and misunderstanding, and just life in Israel it's really dangerous from the beginning of time. And so in order to keep the country in a livable condition so that it's somewhat safe, you need to create a structure. I guess the government had to figure out a way to create a structure where there are constant soldiers that protect the country. And obviously you cannot do that temporarily. It has to happen all the time. And so they figure out a way that to enroll young kids who finish their high school education, whether it's a boy or a girl. So around the age of 18, it's mandatory to serve the country. That's basically, your duty for the country. As we believe that it is a privilege to live in the Holy Land. And so that is, I guess the least that we can do. And so, every boy or girl have to go to the army. Boys go to the army for 3 years. The girls go to the army for 2. And in terms of responsibilities in the army, there are many different responsibilities, right? Obviously, it can begin from hardcore combat, where you are learning how to shoot and you are faced right in front of enemies, and you have to really fight and protect the country. And then on the other spectrum are people who support the administrative aspect of running an army. So in Tel Aviv, which is a very known city in Israel, there are many bases all throughout the country, but one of the biggest bases is called I'm not going to say it in Hebrew, but basically that's where the presidents come, and that's where all the leaders of the country come. And I was affiliated with that base. However, my job in the army was, and I always get some like chuckles from people who hear my story and how I served the country. But basically my job was in the educational department, meaning I was responsible for teaching army kids, but also civilians, all about the history of the army and how the army came to be. And the way the Israeli army was formed, it was really formed by the people and out of the necessity to basically to stay alive and stay safe. And so I'm sure everybody knows about the Holocaust and how after whatever happened in Germany, how 6 million Jews were killed and murdered. There were many Jews who fled to Israel. And so because at the time, Israel was still very much, forming, we did not have we didn't even have a government. And so all of those things, they had to kind of like slowly form, and they formed through illegal forms of gatherings by these kids, really, 18, 17-year-old kids who in many cases had lost their parents and had lost their entire families, but now had this, high toll of surviving. And they formed these illegal operations to fight at the time, the Palestine was occupied by the British. It was under the British mandate. And so they basically wanted them to leave. And so they formed these illegal operations, and there were 3 different kinds of illegal operations, and they were all ranging in terms of, how their politics and what they believe was the right way to negotiate. So one of them was called Hagana, the middle one called Etzel, and the third one was called Lehi. And so they were all very different in their philosophies, but they were formed independently. A lot of people ask what's the difference between them and terrorists. And if you want, I can get into that. But my job was, I was working in the Lehi Museum. So that was like the third operation, who were pretty extreme in terms of their actions. So they would use bombs. They would use, aggressive ways to, to kick out the British out of the country. And the reality is that it worked. Eventually the British did leave, and those illegal operations, by people who were in the Lehi, in Etzel, and the Hagana, they eventually were the first groups who formed. They merged eventually, and they formed what is now known as IDF, Israeli Defense Force. And so my job was, I was working in the Lehi Museum as a guide, and I was basically responsible for telling the story, for sharing the story of our history and how the country was formed and how our army was formed. And the history is so rich, and there's so much misinformation. And maybe for those for those listeners who are wondering, what is the difference between terrorists and whatever people in Lehi or Etzel or Hagana were doing? The difference is very clear. When people in Lehi were fighting, they were only fighting against military people, meaning only against soldiers or against army. Against the British police. They were never doing anything that caused the death of civilians. It was never targeted at specifically civilians. And and if you're comparing that with terrorist groups who are attacking now Israel and I guess all over the world, the difference is that the target is civilians. So that's the story. I loved what I was doing. I loved sharing. I loved my duty. It was a lot of fun, and I've learned so much. And it will always be a huge part of my life, and a huge part of who I am, because I learned so much about myself during these 2 years of myself being in the Army. But that's my story.
Wow. No, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really incredible. I feel that, we might need to incorporate that type of system here in the U.S. to make, and I hate to say that because I never wanted my kids to join the military, but I think it really does change you as a person. It makes you see things in a whole different light, and to learn things about your country that you're serving. Not many of us know all that history. So I think that's really a beautiful thing for you to be able to share that with those of us who had no idea. And I think that's pretty amazing. And so are you able to continue serving if you wanted to, or was that just it, the 2 or the 3 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some people choose to stay in the Army as a form of career. So, for example, there are some people who you can definitely stay, and then that would be a paid position. Mm-hmm. So you get training. One of the reasons why people, and I think that's across the board, across the entire world, that's, it's the same. If you are choosing to work in the Army, then they would pay for your education. Mm-hmm. So a lot of, let's say, doctors and nurses and people, especially in the medical field, because the education, becoming a doctor is so expensive in Israel. Mm-hmm. So there are some people who choose to stay in the Army and get their training, their medical training paid for by the Army, so that then they can, they can always leave. The way I think it works in the Army is they get like contracts. Mm-hmm. And they, I guess, if you choose to stay, then they renew your contract. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely a choice. People can stay.
Okay. Wow. That's really, I love that story. Much. So tell us, so you grew up in a home where you were already being molded to know that you are going to serve. But what else happened at home that changed you?
Yeah, so actually I did not grow up in a home that, I guess it wasn't an ideological, from the point of view of like patriotism. That's not the reason why I served in the country. And so with your permission, I would like to go just a little bit back.
Sure.
To where I was born. I was actually born in the Soviet Union in 1983, where the country I was living in, it was called Uzbekistan. Mm-hmm. And back then, the whole region was under the Soviet Union. And that meant communism. Mm-hmm. And so my parents, and my entire community, they basically lived in that region for over 2,000 years. Like the culture, and I am Jewish. We are, the Jewish tradition and the holidays and the culture. It's so rich and so colorful. I mean, from clothing to food to traditional views of life and all of those things. It's a very rich culture. But when the region became under communist, ruling, it changed, because then people weren't allowed to practice Judaism. They weren't allowed to go to the synagogue, or they weren't allowed to have to have their babies circumcised the way we do, or we weren't allowed to observe the Sabbath. If you're familiar with that, in a Jewish scripture, we are as Jews, obligated or advised by the Bible to take one day off. That's the Saturday, Sabbath, to just rest, just like God did when he created the world. And so all of those ideas and stories, that I've heard as a little girl, had to be basically cut abruptly when I was about 5.5, 6 years old. And that's when the Uzbeks started to attack the city where I was living in, and my city is called Andijan, and basically burn our homes. So they would, at night, they would like bang on the doors and make everybody come out, and then they would just throw these bottles that I don't even know, how are they called in English? The bottles that explode and cause fire.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
So you guys know, you know what I mean. I'm sorry. I as you understand, I am an immigrant. English is not my first language, so I don't know how it's called.
So I
anyway,
can picture it.
Yeah. Okay. So then that's what they would do. These gangs would come to neighborhoods and they would just burn houses down. And so it was just a matter of time before it happened to us. It happened to some of our relatives. And so my family, my parents, they were just obligated to do something. And at the time, the thing that, most people did was flee to Israel, because Israel at the time was forming. They were accepting immigrants, and they were, they wanted to build the country. It was in 1991. And so I remember, as a very young girl, that's when I was very close with my dad, always. But that's when I lost my father. Now, guys, he didn't die, he didn't pass away. He's very much alive still to this day, thank goodness. But I lost him emotionally, because he basically entered the hunter mode as a man, and he had to provide for us financially, but also, for our safety and security. He had to make sure that we are all safe. And so it meant, running around between officials and different government agencies to get the visa to be allowed to leave. And then the other thing, which he had done that, but the other thing, it was such a heavy cost and such a heavy price to pay. And that was, they had to leave everything. So according to the communist, law or condition, they would allow you to leave only if you leave everything you owned behind you, meaning their life savings, their homes, their careers, their stuff. We weren't allowed to take anything other than clothes. And so imagine, I cannot even imagine building and slowly, studying and learning, and then, getting a job, and then my dad owned a business, and then, my parents bought a home, and we started just, and we were just, my sister and I were so little. I was 6 and my sister was 3. So it's those, you know, infancy stages of a young family, and in that very vulnerable stage, they had to just leave everything. And so, you know, I know on the show you talk a lot about PTSD. So I guess my parents had very severe PTSD.
Yeah.
But they never knew that. They never had, you know, I mean, even to this day, my dad never sought out therapy or help, because I guess, you know, growing up under, you know, the Soviet regime, and that's not just me speaking, every single person, and we are very, you know, big community, we're very kind of like intertwined, you know, with one another, and the way we live, it's a very similar trajectory that people go through, and they're all messed up mentally and emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's, you know, as you know, it's a very serious condition.
Right.
And what happened after that, when we came to Israel, my dad, I think his nervous system just collapsed. Unfortunately, he's not aware of it. We're working on it, but he's not aware of it. He wouldn't admit it, but he has a lot of anger. He has a lot of resentment. And as a little girl, I grew up in a home where there was a lot of yelling and scolding, and just like, I feel like it was like an emotional abuse.
Yeah.
And it wasn't intentional. And my dad never, you know, he was never physically violent, but he was very vocally and emotionally violent. And that affected my mom. It affected their marriage. And my parents still to this day, they're married and they love each other. However, there is this huge elephant in the room that messed up everybody in my family. Everybody is affected by this debilitating situation.
Yeah.
And eventually my father, and also life in Israel, with all my love to the country and the Holy Land, and I really do believe in God, and I believe that this is the country of the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
But life in Israel is really, really tough. It's really hard, especially for immigrants. Now, imagine they didn't know the language, so they had to learn the language. Whatever they learned, whatever career they were building in the Soviet Union, that was obsolete. Mm-hmm. So they had to learn and study, and that meant if you don't know the language, how are you going to do that? And in the meantime, you also have to buy food. So it was really, really hard for them. And so my dad never went to school. He never, studied anything. He just, continued to be, an employee and basically a laborer. And that's how he provided for us. And I'm so grateful. I've already kind of bypassed that age where I was just blaming him for all the things. But now, as I am a mom myself and I have children myself, and I am myself responsible for, my dependents, I understand more of what he had to go through, or of what he went through. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, I grew up with this emotional instability. It was almost like I was walking on eggshells my entire life. Yeah. I guess not my entire life, from age 6. Mm-hmm. And then my father decided that he also had some health issues. I don't know if you know, but in Israel and in the Middle East in general, it's the climate there is very hot. Mm-hmm. And so my dad developed this severe asthma, which, is, I think, health issues, you guys already know that health issues are very common with people with PTSD, mm-hmm. As the immune system weakens. So he developed very severe asthma. He couldn't breathe. He really struggled. I remember him really struggling. And then he and my mom I think it was 1995, they visited my mom's family in Canada. So some people left to Israel, some people left to the United States, some people left to Canada, when the Soviet Union, when people were kind of fleeing their homes. And so my mom's aunt came to Canada, and my dad immediately fell in love with the weather and just the culture, the way it is here. And from that point onwards, he vowed to himself that he is going to move and immigrate from Israel to Canada. Now, this too, Annette, took 10 debilitating years.
Oh, wow.
As again, it's a new language and it's a new transition and it's everything is new again. And he every time he tried, there was like rejection after rejection after rejection. Like it was always denied. And you have to understand, during these 10 years, because my dad, he's a very determined man. But this determination was kind of like all or nothing. And what was hurtful to me, I'm going to speak for myself, it was that he didn't want to provide, let's say, healthier living conditions. So we lived in this tiny apartment. At the time, my grandfather and grandmother, they lived with us. And it was just a nightmare. We were all squished in this tiny little apartment. But because he was so determined that he does not want to invest any longer in building in Israel and in having a bigger home and creating anything new, because his whole energy was geared up towards moving again. So that was like another layer of this struggle and this, emotional instability. We basically lived on suitcases for 10 years.
Oh my God.
And eventually, it was terrible. And then eventually, I remember the day, it's interesting because I was already in the army, and I will never forget the day when I came home one day from the army, to find a yellow envelope in the mail. And I saw that the sender was the government of Canada, something like that. And after 10 years, my mom, myself, and my sister, we already kind of like lost hope. We knew that it's not happening. We thought it's not happening, but my dad still kept on working. He still kept on drilling. And his determination eventually paid off. And I remember, coming upstairs, holding this envelope and not believing it, like not believing that it actually happened. And so now I remember like opening the door and sharing this with my mom. And we had this moment where we're like, no, we're not going to show this to Dad. But eventually, of course, we did. But nobody wanted to leave. Nobody, my sister, my mom, nobody other than myself and my dad. I was the one who supported my father. I guess now that I'm thinking about it, the deeper reason for it was because I just wanted to see my dad happy again. I really did.
Yeah.
Because he had been through so much, and that's another point, one of these moments I will never forget in my life, where when we came to Canada, and we already had some family members here who had rented an apartment for us. And I remember us just entering that apartment with our suitcases and all, and putting the suitcases on the floor, on the ground. And then my dad, for the first time in ages, he took this exhale.
Oh,
I remember that moment when his face, like all of his wrinkles and all of that just straightened up. And that was such a powerful moment for me. because I remember feeling the hopefulness. Like I remember feeling like, okay, now finally it's going to happen. Like my dad will have an opportunity to heal in this country. So no more, running around like crazy and just, all this pressure. It was like a pressure cooker. It was crazy. So yeah, so that happened as well. And then 2 years later, I met my husband 2 years after we came here. I was already 21 years old when we came here. I just finished my army duty. And 2 weeks after that, we came to Canada. So everything happened very quickly. And then 2 years after that, when I was 23, I met my husband. And then 2 years later, when I was 25, we got married. And all of the things I'm sharing with you and the listeners today, they happened. I wasn't even aware of them. Yeah. But all of this that can of worms opened up for me when I became a mom myself. And when I was in a place that was safe, when I was in a country where there's so much opportunity, I did have the language. I did have, I knew English. I was loved. I was safe. But still my nervous system, because of all the things I went through, it was encoded for danger. It was encoded for fight and flight. And so I remember the times when I was just like a crazy person yelling and just like completely getting out of control. And that's when I really had to become honest with myself and understand that this is not me. This is not who I am. And this is not who I want to build my marriage. This is not how I want to be as a mom. And that's when my healing started.
Wow. It's really powerful. And it is to go through all of that. And then it's almost like with your dad being able to exhale. Once you had your children, you were able to exhale a little bit because now you're in a whole different place. And you were finally able to see. And it's just, it's absolutely amazing. And so you started your self-healing journey in Canada after all of this.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, because I didn't see a way out. It was, for me, it was either I'm just going to repeat the generational pattern of what I had witnessed at home. And I just had this visceral feeling that this is not how I want my family to be. And I had to, the other space was just venturing into this completely new unknown, which, it's so scary. It is, and it still is. But that is the place where, it's so funny, Annette, that we're talking right now, because where we live in Canada for already 15 years. And it's, what's interesting is that it's the same amount of years we lived in Israel. So we lived in Israel for 15 years. Now we live in Canada for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And so it's the same amount of time. And right now, what's happening with my father is that he is, again, right? Like, we are safe, like we're okay. But again, because his poor nervous system and his adrenals, like, and his, his cortisol, I think, is pumping in his system nonstop because of the, that pattern of fear and insecurity and instability that he grew up with. Mm-hmm. Now what's happening is that he is perpetuating it when there is no evident threat.
Yeah.
And so where we are right now in terms of, you know, helping my dad to see it is that just recently something really awful happened in our family where he had completely lost. Am I allowed to swear in this podcast?
Yes.
Okay. He had lost his shit in front of everybody. Like, we were having a family meal and somebody said something and he made such a big, like, it was such a dramatic, you know, explosive experience. And again, it touched everybody. It affects me, it affects my family, it affects my kids, who I worked so hard to never see what I had seen, to never experience what I had experienced, right? To grow in comfort and in love and in safety. And they had seen my dad going through this, you know, crazy time, and being so reactive and being so explosive. And what was interesting was because I had seen myself changing and shifting so much, because I went from being the deprived little girl who lost her daddy, to now this woman who is wiser, who is a little bit smarter, who is now a mother and a wife herself, to seeing my dad's pain. I just had seen him as maybe a 5 or 4-year-old little boy who is just tantruming. And it's heartbreaking to see an adult grown man. My dad is in his 60s now, you know, going through that. It really is heartbreaking. But where I'm going with this is that for the first time in my life, I feel like I now have this window to help my dad. And that's another piece, by the way, Annette. I don't know if you kind of like if you're gathering that from what I'm sharing, but because I am such an empath, and I am I've always been very much in tune with my feelings and emotions, but I've always felt like I'm not allowed to feel, because feeling brings me so much pain. But I had to learn to protect myself. I had to, you know, to learn to cope. And my coping mechanism was pretending. And my coping mechanism was also kind of like carrying the weight of my parents' pain on my shoulders, which was so heavy. So heavy. And I remember working through this with my therapist and my coaches, where they taught me that, Dorit, it's not your job to parent your parents.
Yeah.
It's not. And it's so hard to not do, because they are my parents.
Yeah.
And I know so much, and I went through healing, and I've chosen therapy, and now look at me. I you know, I'm enlightened. Right? So there's so much there as well. It's really, 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 really hard to see your parents going through hard time, not being able to cope emotionally. And I had took on all of that. So that was another layer of my healing, you know, and all of that I had to look into that. I had to be really honest with me and who I am, because, and it's interesting because the work that I now do in the world with women, and most of my clients are women who are wives and mothers, who also have this family trauma, family of origin, the trauma that they've brought from their family of origin being reawakened. And that is being the way it's manifested, and the way it was manifested for me was this huge drain of energy. I was just tired all the time. I couldn't work. I only had energy to just barely survive, to just tend to the logistics of my household. But that wasn't a normal, healthy life. That wasn't joyful living. I definitely didn't feel like I am living up to my potential as a woman. So all of those things I had to really honestly look at them so that I can finally decide how I want to live. Yeah. So it all goes back to energy for me. Energy in the body, energy, that you carry with yourself, whether it's your aura or the way you kind of understand yourself as a container for life, and also boundaries. I'm still learning how to create solid, kind, but very strong boundaries with my parents, because we were so enmeshed. We were like so intertwined, and so, yeah.
That takes a lot of strength to want to do what you're doing, to finally be able to see what exactly you wanted out of life, because you did. You carried that for so many years, just trying to make your parents happy, trying to see your dad happy. And I can't, I'm sitting here listening to your story, and I'm shaking, and I'm nodding my head thinking, oh my gosh, I resonate with some of this so much, because our parents grew up in that generation where they didn't talk about it. They didn't go see therapists. They did not ask for help. And then that was passed down to us until we finally realized, no, I can't do this. I need to say, I need to talk to somebody or I'm going to explode. And so I'm seeing this in myself while you're speaking. And I think it's just, it takes strength. It takes courage, because it's scary. And it's huge.
It is. It is.
It's so,
yeah.
so hard. It is so hard to see your parents go through that, and you could tell them every day, all day, why don't you go talk to somebody? And they'll look at you like, are you kidding me? I'm not going to tell my business to other people.
Yeah, especially for men. It's really hard to do. My mom did go see somebody, and she is working with somebody.
That's what.
Yeah, but my dad is, no, instant. This is what I always tell my dad. I'm like, Daddy, as long as, because he's always, I don't know if you can resonate with that, but the way men are in our culture, is, we're very patriarchal and very traditional in that sense, that the men are taught to be the providers, and to provide financially for their family, whatever that means. And then once you are done, meaning you're an empty nester, you are basically useless. And so there are so many men in my community who are already in their mid 60s, and they feel that they're just useless to the world. And it's so heartbreaking. And it's just part of this, of this upbringing, and the belief that it's all very self-centered, right? Me. But in my culture, it's very rare that there is this thought about, let's say, doing something for the community, or volunteering, or doing something for the greater good. Where I think these people, especially, in that age, that's where they could be the most useful to the world. But instead, what I'm seeing people in my community doing is that they still work until you're allowed to. And then they're going to basically bury themselves in front of the TV for the whole day. So the entire day, they're just going to eat and watch TV. And for me, it's so heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking to see men, especially men. I see this problem very, very clearly in my community, especially with men. With women too, but women are still, I guess, because women are a little bit more social. Women still do have more or less social life, right? My mom, for example, and my mother-in-law, like they go to yoga, and they still have like social circles and women's circles. But men are really, really struggling now. That coupled with an undiagnosed PTSD.
Yes.
With all the trauma that they've carried for all these years, and the regret that they carry on their shoulders, and the unsatisfaction from life, it like all of the stuff they're carrying with them. And it makes life unbearable. So I do understand why my dad, still in his mid-60s, is having tantrums. I understand. However, it's not healthy. Right. It's not healthy. And the other part is that everybody keeps telling him, you should, you're a grown man, you can no longer behave like this. It's touching everybody. It's affecting everybody. But what I am seeing is that he does not have the capacity to see others, because he still hasn't mastered taking care of himself.
Yeah.
And the heartbreak and the tragedy, really, I call this human tragedy, is that until he realizes that, nothing else can happen, like nothing else can heal. And I really do hope that he will be more honest with himself and more courageous, and he will really see himself as worthy of healing.
Yeah, that's so heartbreaking. That you're right. There's so many men out there who feel if they can no longer do what they used to do, provide and work and all that they feel useless. Like there's nothing else left for them. But there really is, and there's got to be a way to help them realize that. But I guess once you get to a certain age, you're just that stubborn that you just don't see it and you don't want to hear it. And so it's so difficult to communicate that to them. Oh.
Yeah. And then that like the natural aging piece, coupled with understanding of simple biology, mm-hmm. that especially, it happens with women too, but for men, their testosterone, right, their sex hormone, mm-hmm. Begins to decline once they reach. It starts to decline rapidly in their mid-40s. Mm-hmm. And so that is a big part of why so many men don't have energy and don't have the will. And all they want to do is just, pluck themselves in front of the TV. However, if hormones is the problem, it's so easy to fix. Like you can actually fix that. You can do some bioidentical hormones, or you can try exercising. Exercising boosts, your endorphins and makes you feel, more alive. And again, also having strengthening your body, right? And so again, I think it's really difficult and almost impossible from my experience to do unless you believe that you are worthy of feeling good and being joyful. And then the other piece, what I'm seeing is that like a lot of these men in my community who went through the same story like my dad did, they're very much disconnected spiritually. Meaning they are lacking that connection with higher power, whether it's God, the universe, whatever it is, to inspire them that there's something greater, something bigger than themselves. and to continue leaning in to that. Because I guess, especially in this age, material stuff, they don't matter anymore.
Right.
And what you're left with is just who you are and who you think you are, and the contribution you've had, in the lives you've touched.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very much, it's an evolving story. Let me put it this way.
So what do you do now to help others? And do you feel like you're in a better place as far as your self-healing?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's night and day. So for me, my barometer, I guess how I know if I'm doing well is if I'm, yelling in home. So I haven't yelled in, oh my gosh, months, even throughout coronavirus. So for me, this is like such a relief, because I grew up in an emotionally unstable home.
Right.
And what I wanted and still want more than anything to provide for my kids is this, the complete opposite. I want to provide for them, emotional stability. I want to provide for them, I want them to be seen and heard. And of course, please, the listeners, and you also, Annette, please don't think that I am judging my father or my parents or blaming them. Believe me, I went through that too. I went through the piece where I was like, but it's not fair, and why was I born to these people, and like, I'm already past that, because it's not useful, it's not helpful, and because I've allowed in my own life to lean into God and lean into, higher purpose. And then if you believe in those things, you understand that you actually are the one who choose your parents. And I do truly believe in that. And it's such a huge they are such a huge part of my story, of my story of becoming who I want to be and who I'm destined to be. And then I'm also so grateful for my dad that he brought us here, because that's where I found, that's where I met my soulmate, and that's where we've built and created a family.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of pieces to this, but my work right now is dedicated to helping women really hone in the power of their female body from the perspective of understanding how to cultivate, how to create, and also sustain energy throughout our entire life. So that means the courage to look, into your past. It means the courage to really sift through the crap and really being vulnerable and courageous to open up this can of worms and talk about, what your dad did when you were 6 years old or 7 years old. Or, for me, I remember the insults. And one of the hardest things that my father told me was he repeatedly called me a slut. Repeatedly. And that was a hard pill to swallow. And I knew even in those moments when he had said those things, I knew he didn't mean them ever. And I knew he always did that because of his own emotional instability and immaturity. But yet it's in me, right? How do I kind of heal and untangle myself from that, right? How do I not let this become my identity? And for me, a lot of those things happened through relationships. And so I attracted, and that was still in Israel, I attracted completely the wrong man into my life. And I ended up wasting 5 precious years of my life believing that I have to be somebody, or whatever I thought being a woman meant. I lost my virginity when I was 18 years old. to this man because I believed that, that's what a sexy woman is. And you eat in a certain way, and you move in a certain way, and you flirt in a certain way, because I didn't know at all who I am as a woman. I didn't know at all. Yeah. And so I had to redefine that. I had to really dive deep into womanhood and into motherhood and into wifehood and into women's health, and really understanding myself. Right. And again, energy is like the bigger piece for me. And so what I do now is I work with women one-on-one who are now wives and mothers, and also business owners who are struggling, who feel stuck to manifest the life of their dreams because of the decades long trauma they are carrying from their family of origin. And really redefining and understanding what it means to be a woman, and how God designed our female body in terms of, our energy system, that is very, very much different than a man's energy system. Mm-hmm. A huge piece of that is the way our hormonal system works. So when we understand all of that, all of a sudden, you begin to feel like, oh, I do have the energy, so it's not only doing like the things that I have to do, right? The running my home, or the logistics, or, doing my job, or taking care of the must-haves, the things that are basically life's necessities. But now I actually have energy and life force to desire, let's say, more sex. Like, it's in my tagline. I work with women. I help them to create more energy, so that by the time kids are finally in bed, you choose sex, or to connect with your partner, instead of binging on Netflix, which so many women do. So many women do. Right? So it's the life force. It's the feeling of, it's that juice of life that I remember. It was as though it was sucked out of me. It literally felt like something was sucked out of me. I was sucked dry for so many years. And as a mom, especially, because I'm raising daughters, I could not live with the fact that I am modeling for them a life that is lifeless, a life that is not joyful, a life that is not fun. And I could not look in my daughter's eyes and tell her, honey, here, this is why you should get married. This is why you should have kids. It's going to be amazing. I could not do that authentically. I felt like I'm a fraud. I felt like I'm lying to my children. And so I had to do this work with myself. And so now I'm so grateful that I get to, work with other women who feel really, really confused, who feel really, really dry and empty, like an empty vessel, who are just sleepwalking through life and wishing for the day to just be over already. And life, it has so much more in store for you when you actually, gain the courage and become the woman who you were destined to be.
That's incredible. Wow. Well, thank you for doing what you do, because I know there's plenty of women out there who are going to need to talk to somebody like you. So, yeah, your whole message it was so powerful, and I absolutely appreciate you sharing it all, because I can't imagine, but then again, it's amazing to see the woman that you are now. because of it. And so I know that I, for one, was not judging you at all, or no thinking that you were judging your father, because I can resonate with with how my father was as well. But I still think it's a beautiful thing that you have now come into the point of your life where you can understand why he did what he did and then appreciate that more. So it's this whole thing is just absolutely incredible. And where can the listeners find you to get this powerful message that you have been spreading?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm all over the internet. You can find me over at my website, so www.doritpalvanov.com. You are also very welcome to subscribe to my podcast. It's called The Confident, Energized and Sexy Mama. If you are on Facebook, join my group. It's called Confident, Energy and Sexy Mama's Village. And if you're on Instagram, then you can find me by my handle at Dorit Palvanov Coaching. I'm all over the internet. I always put things out there, my posts, my Insta stories. And really this is the heart of what I do. Especially if you are raising daughters, I think this is your duty to look at yourself from the perspective of raising yourself alongside raising your daughters, because there's so much that you can learn from your kids, especially, when they're really young. It's almost like getting a second chance at being a child again, right? Because I was under so much stress and under so much trauma, I almost was like, I was just walking through life unconsciously. And so I didn't even remember how I used to think as a 6-year-old, as a 7-year-old, as an 8-year-old, as a 10-year-old. I had forgotten. And so my kids are giving me this opportunity to be a little girl again and really heal that wounded, daughter that I was, and really step into the woman I want to be for them.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And I can understand that, because I have a daughter who, we don't think that they're watching or listening to the things that we do, but in fact that they are. So we have to remember, how do I want my own daughter to grow up to be? What kind of person do I want her to be? And it starts with ourselves, because we're their model, their role model. So it's amazing what you do. And gosh, I just, I really appreciate you being on here and sharing such a personal story, but also for the work that you do. So thank you so much, Dorit, for reaching out and being on here.
Thank you so much for saying yes, and thank you for sharing.
Of course. So for the listeners, I'm going to definitely put this in the show notes and in the podcast guide. So make sure you are following that. And again, thank you so much. I can't wait to share this story.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the True Sweet High podcast, created and founded by your host, Annette, the founder of A Wild Ride Call Life. Also, a big thank you to all of our sponsors for each and every episode that is aired. We have so much support from them and all of our listeners. You can find more information at www.awildridecalllife.com.